In February 1945, Commonwealth forces established a temporary holding facility 30 kilometers southeast of Manila, near the town of Antipolo. The compound, designated Facility Echo 7, housed displaced persons evacuated from areas under Japanese occupation. Among them were 43 young women, ages 16 to 22, who had been working in administrative roles for Japanese military installations before the Allied advance forced their evacuation. According to archived Royal Canadian Women's Army Corps reports, dated March 2, 1945, these women exhibited what medical officers described as acute stress reactions. The facility's commanding officer, Major Thomas Henderson of the Canadian Army, noted in his weekly summary that the women refused to leave their assigned quarters after sunset and displayed heightened anxiety when male personnel approached their section. The women had been processed through standard evacuation procedures. Their identification cards, issued by Japanese administrative offices in Manila, listed occupations as clerks, translators, and communications assistants. Nothing in their documentation suggested involvement in combat operations or exposure to battlefield conditions. Yet medical reports from the facility's chief physician, Captain Margaret Walsh, documented symptoms typically associated with combat veterans. Captain Walsh's notes, preserved in the National Archives of Canada, describe recurring nightmares, hypervigilance, and what she termed exaggerated startle responses. The women spoke frequently among themselves in hushed tones, often glancing toward the facility's main gate as if expecting someone's arrival. When questioned through interpreters, they provided consistent but limited information about their work assignments in Manila. The facility operated under strict protocols. Male personnel were prohibited from entering the women's quarters without female escort. Meals were delivered by Canadian servicewomen assigned to the compound. Despite these precautions, the detainees' anxiety levels remained elevated throughout their first weeks at Echo 7. On March 15, 1945, facility guards reported unusual activity in the women's section. Around 10:30 in the evening, screaming erupted from Building C, where the Japanese women were housed. Guard Corporal James Mackenzie's incident report states that the women were found huddled together in the building's central corridor, despite regulations requiring them to remain in their assigned rooms after lights out. The duty interpreter, Private First Class Helen Nakamura, a Japanese-Canadian soldier from British Columbia, attempted to communicate with the distressed women. According to her report, filed the following morning, the women repeatedly used the phrase, "Kare ga kaete kuru," he is coming back. When pressed for clarification, they pointed toward the facility's perimeter fence, specifically the section facing southeast toward the hills overlooking Antipolo. Facility security conducted a thorough perimeter check. No breaches were detected. No unauthorized personnel were observed in the surrounding area. The guard posts reported no unusual movement or sounds, yet the women remained in a state of extreme agitation until dawn. Major Henderson's correspondence with his superior, Brigadier Robert Mills in Manila, requested guidance on handling what he described as a persistent disciplinary challenge. The women's refusal to follow established routines was disrupting facility operations. More concerning was their apparent fear of something or someone outside the compound's boundaries. The facility's psychological evaluation officer, Lieutenant Sarah Chen, conducted individual interviews with 12 of the women during the third week of March. Her reports, classified until 1947, revealed a consistent pattern in their testimonies. Each woman described a Japanese officer who had supervised their work in Manila. The descriptions varied in physical details, but all referenced the same rank insignia and unit designation. According to these interviews, the officer in question held the rank of major and served with the Japanese 14th Area Army. The women consistently referred to him by a single name, Sakura. Whether this was his actual name or a nickname remained unclear. What was certain was the profound impact his supervision had left on these women. Lieutenant Chen's psychological assessment noted that mentions of this officer triggered immediate stress responses. Subjects exhibited increased heart rate, perspiration, and what she described as dissociative episodes when asked about their daily routines in Manila. Several women became unable to complete sentences when discussing their work environment. The facility's interpreter, Private Nakamura, reported that the women spoke in whispers when discussing their previous assignment. They used euphemisms and indirect language even when speaking among themselves. Direct questions about their supervisor resulted in silence or requests to change the subject. On March 22nd, facility personnel observed a marked change in the women's behavior. They had begun organizing themselves into a rigid hierarchy, with the eldest woman assuming apparent leadership. Mealtimes became regimented. The women formed precise lines and moved in coordinated groups. This self-imposed structure resembled military protocol more than civilian behavior. Captain Walsh's medical log from this period documents a decrease in reported symptoms of anxiety. The women appeared calmer, more organized. However, their vigilance regarding the facility's perimeter had intensified. They took turns maintaining watch at the windows facing southeast, particularly during evening hours. The facility's communication logs show increased radio traffic during late March. Manila headquarters requested daily status updates on the detainees. These requests came through encrypted channels, typically reserved for intelligence matters rather than routine administration. Major Henderson's queries about the unusual attention his facility was receiving went unanswered. On April 1st, a Canadian Women's Army Corps unit arrived at Facility Echo 7 without advance notice. The unit, designated Special Service Company, consisted of 12 women led by Sergeant Olivia Carter. Their orders, signed by Brigadier Mills, transferred responsibility for the Japanese detainees from facility security to the newly arrived unit. Sergeant Carter's personnel file, obtained from Canadian military archives, showed extensive service in intelligence operations. Born in Toronto in 1918, she had enlisted in 1941 and served in England before assignment to the Pacific Theatre. Her linguistic qualifications included conversational Japanese, acquired during a 6-month training program in Australia. The transfer of custody occurred without incident. The Japanese women showed no resistance to the change in supervision. However, facility guards noted that their demeanor shifted noticeably when Sergeant Carter's unit took control. The rigid organization they had maintained dissolved. The constant watching of the perimeter ceased. Captain Walsh's final medical report on the detainees, dated April 3rd, noted a marked improvement in their psychological state. Sleep patterns normalized, group anxiety decreased. The hypervigilance that had characterized their behavior since arrival had virtually disappeared. Major Henderson's closing report on the incident, filed on April 5th, recommended that future evacuee processing include enhanced psychological screening. He noted that the women's extreme stress reactions had consumed disproportionate medical and security resources. However, he could not explain why the arrival of female Canadian personnel had such a dramatic calming effect. The facility's operational records show that Sergeant Carter's unit maintained control over the detainees for 3 weeks. During this period, no unusual incidents were reported. The women participated in routine activities, accepted medical treatment, and began basic English language instruction provided by the Canadian servicewomen. Private Nakamura's translation services were no longer required after the first week of April. Her final report noted that the Japanese women had begun communicating directly with their Canadian supervisors using basic English phrases. The whispered conversations in Japanese had stopped entirely. On April 24th, the detainees were transferred to a repatriation facility in Manila. Their departure from Echo 7 was documented as routine. No special precautions were noted. No requests for enhanced security were made. The women boarded the transport vehicles without incident. Sergeant Carter's unit remained at the facility for an additional week before receiving new orders. During this period, they conducted what their mission reports described as security review procedures. These activities involved examination of facility records, interview of personnel, and inspection of the grounds. The security review uncovered no irregularities in facility operations. However, Carter's final report included a recommendation that future evacuee processing sites maintain enhanced perimeter surveillance, particularly during nighttime hours. She noted that isolated locations could create psychological stress for detainees who had experienced trauma during evacuation. Facility Echo 7 continued operations until Japanese surrender in September 1945. No subsequent incidents involving evacuee populations were reported. The facility was decommissioned in October 1945 and converted to civilian use by Philippine authorities. The fate of the 43 Japanese women processed through the facility remains unclear. Repatriation records from Manila show their names on transport manifests to Japan, dated May 1945. However, Japanese immigration authorities have no records of their arrival. The transport ship, designated Vessel 779, was reported lost to engine failure while at sea. Captain Walsh's post-war medical research included a paper on combat stress reactions among civilian populations, published in the Canadian Medical Journal in 1947. The paper referenced her observations at Facility Echo 7 without naming specific cases. She noted that civilian exposure to military environments could produce symptoms indistinguishable from combat fatigue. Lieutenant Chen's psychological studies, conducted after the war, focused on group trauma responses among displaced populations. Her research, published by the University of Toronto in 1949, included observations from her work with evacuees in the Philippines. She noted that collective anxiety could manifest as shared delusions or false memories. The Japanese officer referred to as Sakura was never identified through official channels. No records in captured Japanese military archives contain references to an officer using that designation. The 14th Area Army's personnel files, examined during war crimes investigations, show no major matching the physical descriptions provided by the detainees. Private Nakamura's post-war testimony to military investigators included details about her interactions with the Japanese women. She stated that their references to Sakura seemed more mythological than factual. The women spoke of him as if he possessed knowledge of their current location, despite being thousands of kilometers away. According to Nakamura's statement, the women believed Sakura could track them regardless of distance. They spoke of his ability to find anyone who had worked under his supervision. This belief explained their constant vigilance and their fear of his imminent arrival at the facility. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police investigated reports of Japanese military personnel operating in the Philippines after official surrender. Their findings, classified until 1967, documented several instances of isolated Japanese soldiers refusing to surrender. However, no evidence supported the existence of organized intelligence operations targeting former administrative personnel. Sergeant Carter's post-war interview with military historians provided additional context about her unit's mission at Facility Echo 7. She stated that intelligence reports had indicated possible Japanese infiltration attempts targeting evacuee facilities. Her unit's assignment was to assess security vulnerabilities and implement countermeasures. Carter described the Japanese women as exhibiting behavior consistent with prolonged psychological manipulation. She noted that their fear responses seemed calibrated to specific triggers rather than generalized anxiety. This suggested systematic conditioning rather than random trauma exposure. The Special Service Company's mission reports, declassified in 1962, revealed that Carter's unit had encountered similar cases at other facilities. Groups of Japanese civilians, particularly young women, often displayed coordinated behavioral patterns that suggested previous military-style conditioning. These patterns included automatic response to authority figures, rigid adherence to hierarchical structures, and extreme sensitivity to perceived threats from specific directions or locations. Carter theorized that Japanese military units had employed psychological conditioning techniques on civilian administrative personnel. The technique, as described in Carter's analysis, involved creating artificial dependencies and fears that would persist even after physical separation from supervisors. This would ensure continued loyalty and discourage defection or collaboration with enemy forces. Carter's unit developed countermeasures designed to break these conditioning patterns. The techniques involved establishing alternative authority structures, providing consistent security assurances, and gradually introducing new behavioral patterns that replaced the conditioned responses. The success of these techniques was demonstrated at Facility Echo 7. The Japanese women's transformation from terrified, vigilant detainees to cooperative evacuees occurred within days of the Canadian women's arrival. The rapid improvement suggested that the conditioning could be reversed through appropriate intervention. However, Carter's reports also noted that the conditioning appeared to resurface under stress. During their final week at the facility, several women experienced what she described as regression episodes, when thunder from a tropical storm triggered their previous vigilance behaviors. The medical logs from April 1945 show that 3 of the women required sedation during these episodes. They had reverted to the whispered communications and constant watching that had characterized their early weeks at the facility. Only direct supervision by Canadian personnel prevented complete regression, Dr. Walsh's observations during these episodes provided insight into the nature of the women's conditioning. She noted that their stress responses activated when they perceived themselves as unprotected by appropriate authority figures. The presence of Canadian servicewomen seemed to fulfill a protective role that civilian staff could not provide. The implications of these observations troubled facility leadership. If the women's psychological state depended on specific types of supervision, their successful reintegration into civilian life seemed unlikely. Traditional support systems would not provide the military-style authority structure they had been conditioned to require. Major Henderson's recommendations to higher command included provisions for extended psychological rehabilitation before repatriation. He argued that releasing these women without addressing their conditioning would condemn them to permanent anxiety and social dysfunction. The response from Manila headquarters was swift and definitive. The women would be processed for immediate repatriation, according to standard protocols. No special provisions would be made for extended rehabilitation. The matter was considered closed. Sergeant Carter's final report challenged this decision. She documented evidence that the women's conditioning made them vulnerable to re-exploitation by Japanese military personnel who might still be operating in occupied territories. Premature repatriation could expose them to the very influences they had been conditioned to obey. Her warnings went unheeded. On May 19, 1945, the 43 women boarded Vessel 779 for transport to Japan. Carter's unit had been reassigned to other duties and was not present for the departure. The vessel's disappearance was initially attributed to mechanical failure. Post-war investigation suggested possible sabotage, though no definitive evidence was recovered. The ship's manifest and crew records were lost when the vessel failed to reach its destination. Years later, intelligence reports from the Pacific region included occasional references to organized groups of Japanese women operating in remote areas. These reports, dismissed as rumors by official authorities, described women who moved in military formations and avoided contact with occupation forces. The reports shared common elements. The women operated under strict hierarchical command, communicated through coded language, and demonstrated unusual knowledge of Allied movement patterns. Some accounts suggested they were gathering intelligence for Japanese personnel who had refused to surrender. Private Nakamura's post-war research into Japanese military conditioning techniques uncovered documents describing systematic psychological manipulation programs. These programs, developed by the Kempeitai military police, were designed to create unbreakable loyalty among civilian personnel working in sensitive positions. The techniques involved isolation from family support structures, creation of artificial dependency relationships, and systematic reinforcement of fear responses to specific triggers. Subjects would be conditioned to experience severe anxiety when separated from their designated supervisors. According to these documents, the conditioning was designed to be irreversible without specialized intervention. Subjects would remain psychologically bound to their supervisors regardless of physical separation or changing circumstances. This ensured absolute loyalty even in hostile environments. The documents also revealed that subjects were often unaware of their conditioning. They experienced their dependency and fear responses as natural reactions rather than artificially implanted behaviors. This made detection and treatment extremely difficult. Dr. Walsh's post-war analysis of the facility Echo 7 cases supported these findings. She concluded that the Japanese women had been subjected to sophisticated psychological manipulation that created artificial trauma responses. Their fear of Sakura was a conditioned reaction rather than memory of actual abuse. The conditioning explained their behavior patterns, constant vigilance for their supervisor's return, rigid hierarchical organization, and extreme anxiety when placed under non-Japanese authority. These responses had been systematically implanted to ensure compliance and prevent defection. Carter's success in managing these women demonstrated that the conditioning could be countered through appropriate techniques. However, the intervention required specialized training and extended time periods. Standard evacuation procedures were insufficient to address the complexity of the psychological manipulation. The loss of Vessel 779 prevented verification of whether the women's conditioning had been successfully reversed. Carter's report suggested that permanent recovery would require years of specialized treatment in controlled environments. The facility's records were sealed in 1946 and transferred to classified archives. Access was restricted to personnel with specific security clearances. The official reason given was protection of medical privacy for former detainees. However, intelligence analysts suspected that the records contained information about Japanese psychological warfare techniques that could be exploited by hostile forces. The conditioning methods used on civilian personnel represented a significant security vulnerability if replicated by other nations. Major Henderson's post-war career included assignment to NATO psychological operations research. His experience with conditioned civilian populations informed development of countermeasures against similar techniques. However, details of his research remained classified throughout his lifetime. The facility Echo 7 incident was never publicly disclosed. Official histories of Canadian operations in the Philippines make no reference to the facility or its unusual detainee population. The existence of specialized conditioning among Japanese civilian personnel remains absent from academic studies of the Pacific War. Sergeant Carter's unit was dissolved in June 1945, and its members were reassigned to separate commands. No reunion or follow-up contact was authorized. Carter herself was transferred to occupation duties in Germany, where her experience with psychological operations proved valuable. The techniques developed at Facility Echo 7 were incorporated into Allied procedures for handling conditioned personnel. However, the specific details were classified and shared only with selected intelligence organizations. The methods required specialized training that was not widely available. Dr. Walsh's medical research contributed to understanding of trauma-based conditioning in civilian populations. Her work influenced development of treatment protocols for victims of systematic psychological manipulation. However, the specific cases that informed her research were never publicly identified. The broader implications of the Facility Echo 7 incident remained classified for decades. The possibility that entire populations could be conditioned for intelligence purposes represented a fundamental shift in understanding of psychological warfare capabilities. Intelligence agencies recognized that traditional concepts of loyalty and allegiance might be insufficient to predict behavior among populations exposed to sophisticated conditioning techniques. New security protocols were required to identify and manage conditioned individuals. The fate of the 43 women remained unknown. Periodic intelligence reports from Asia included unconfirmed sightings of organized female groups operating in remote areas. However, these reports were never verified through official channels. Some intelligence analysts theorized that the women had been retrieved by Japanese personnel who had prepared contingency plans for such situations. The conditioning would have made them psychologically incapable of resisting orders to return to their supervisor's control. Alternative theories suggested that the women had been eliminated to prevent disclosure of the conditioning techniques. The psychological manipulation methods represented valuable intelligence that Japanese military leaders would not want to fall into Allied hands. The truth remained elusive. Official records provided no conclusive evidence about the women's ultimate fate. The incident at Facility Echo 7 became a classified footnote in the broader history of psychological operations during the Pacific War. Years later, researchers studying wartime conditioning techniques would find scattered references to similar incidents throughout the Pacific Theater. Groups of Japanese civilians, particularly young women, often displayed behavioral patterns suggesting systematic psychological manipulation. These cases shared common characteristics: extreme anxiety when separated from Japanese authority figures, rigid adherence to hierarchical structures, and conditioned fear responses to specific triggers. The patterns suggested widespread use of conditioning techniques among civilian personnel in sensitive positions. However, the full scope of these operations was never documented. Japanese records were either destroyed or remained inaccessible. Allied intelligence files were classified indefinitely. The psychological warfare techniques developed during the Pacific conflict remained largely unknown to academic researchers. The Facility Echo 7 incident represented one of the few documented cases where conditioned individuals were successfully identified and managed. However, the ultimate failure to provide appropriate treatment demonstrated the limitations of Allied understanding of psychological manipulation. The women's disappearance highlighted the vulnerabilities created by inadequate response to systematic conditioning. Without proper intervention, conditioned individuals remained susceptible to re-exploitation by their original controllers. The incident also demonstrated the importance of specialized training for personnel dealing with conditioned populations. Standard military procedures were insufficient to address the complexity of trauma-based psychological manipulation. Sergeant Carter's success in managing the women suggested that effective countermeasures were possible. However, the techniques required extensive specialized knowledge and resources that were not readily available in field operations. The classification of the incident prevented broader dissemination of the lessons learned. Knowledge about conditioning techniques and countermeasures remained restricted to small groups within intelligence organizations. This limitation had significant implications for post-war operations. Allied forces encountered conditioned populations throughout occupied territories, but most personnel lacked the training necessary to identify and manage these individuals effectively. The result was repeated failures to address psychological conditioning among civilian populations. Many conditioned individuals were processed through standard evacuation procedures without recognition of their specialized needs. Some of these individuals likely remained under the psychological control of their original handlers throughout the occupation period. Others may have experienced severe psychological distress when separated from their conditioned authority structures without appropriate intervention. The broader implications for post-war society remained largely unexamined. The number of individuals who had been subjected to conditioning techniques was unknown. Their integration into post-war civilian life proceeded without recognition of their special psychological needs. Intelligence organizations recognized that systematic conditioning represented a continuing threat in future conflicts. The techniques could be employed by any military organization with sufficient psychological warfare capabilities. However, the classification of relevant research prevented development of adequate countermeasures. Knowledge about conditioning and its treatment remained restricted to specialized units within intelligence agencies. The Facility Echo 7 incident thus represented both a success and a failure in addressing psychological warfare. The immediate management of conditioned individuals had been successful, but the broader implications were neither understood nor addressed. The 43 women who had passed through the facility remained symbols of the unresolved challenges posed by systematic psychological manipulation. Their fate, unknown and likely unknowable, represented the human cost of inadequate response to sophisticated psychological warfare techniques. The official silence surrounding their case reflected institutional reluctance to acknowledge the full scope of psychological conditioning operations during the Pacific conflict. This silence prevented development of adequate safeguards for future operations involving similar populations. In the classified archives of 3 nations, fragmentary records of Facility Echo 7 remained sealed. The incident that had demonstrated both the reality of systematic conditioning and the possibility of effective countermeasures continued to influence intelligence operations decades later. The lessons learned were incorporated into classified training programs for specialized personnel. However, the broader knowledge necessary to address conditioning techniques in civilian populations remained restricted to small groups within intelligence organizations. The women who had experienced systematic psychological manipulation during their service with Japanese forces became classified symbols of unresolved challenges in psychological warfare. Their conditioning, their brief rehabilitation, and their ultimate disappearance represented the complexities of addressing trauma-based psychological manipulation in military environments. The incident at Facility Echo 7 remained a classified reminder that warfare extends beyond conventional weapons and tactics. The human mind itself had become a battlefield, with civilian populations as unwitting participants in psychological operations of unprecedented sophistication. Until today, no consensus exists regarding the full scope of conditioning operations conducted during the Pacific conflict. The classified nature of relevant records prevents comprehensive understanding of psychological warfare techniques employed against civilian populations. The 43 women processed through Facility Echo 7 remain representative of unknown numbers of individuals who experienced systematic psychological manipulation during wartime service. Their stories, untold and likely untellable, reflect the human cost of psychological warfare operations that extended far beyond conventional military engagement. The classified archives of Canadian military intelligence contain one final document related to Facility Echo 7. Filed in 1947, 2 years after the incident, the report carries the signature of Colonel David Morrison, Chief of Pacific Operations Analysis. Colonel Morrison's document references a discovery made during the systematic review of wartime intelligence files. Hidden within routine administrative papers from Facility Echo 7 was a single sheet of rice paper, found pressed between pages of a supply requisition form. The paper contained text written in Japanese characters, using what appeared to be charcoal or burnt wood. Translation services identified the writing as a message from one of the detained women. The text was dated April 23, 1945, the day before their departure for repatriation. According to the translation, the message was addressed to those who might follow. It warned that Sakura had not been a single individual, but rather a systematic program designed to create psychological dependencies among administrative personnel. The women had discovered this truth during their final weeks at the facility. The message revealed that their collective conditioning had been part of a broader operation involving hundreds of young women throughout Japanese-occupied territories. Each group believed they were supervised by a unique officer named Sakura, but the conditioning techniques were identical across all installations. The discovery explained the women's behavior patterns and their shared fears. They had not been responding to memories of a specific individual, but to systematic programming designed to ensure loyalty through manufactured psychological dependency. The conditioning created artificial attachment to authority figures who may never have existed as described. The rice paper message concluded with a warning that the conditioning could be reactivated through specific triggers. Even after apparent recovery, the women had realized that their improvement at Facility Echo 7 might be temporary, dependent on continued presence of substitute authority figures. This final revelation cast new light on Sergeant Carter's success with the women. Her unit had not broken their conditioning, but rather substituted new authority figures for the original psychological dependencies. Without continued intervention, the women remained vulnerable to regression. The implications were sobering. The 43 women transported on Vessel 779 had carried their conditioning with them. If they had survived the voyage, they would have remained psychologically vulnerable to reactivation by anyone with knowledge of their trigger patterns. Colonel Morrison's analysis concluded that the vessel's disappearance might not have been accidental. Japanese intelligence operations could have arranged the loss to prevent disclosure of their conditioning techniques, while simultaneously recovering valuable human assets. The women's psychological manipulation had made them permanent security risks. Their detailed knowledge of Allied procedures, combined with their conditioned loyalty to Japanese authority structures, represented ongoing intelligence vulnerabilities that standard security clearance procedures could not address. The rice paper message was the last known communication from any of the 43 women. No subsequent reports mentioned organized groups of Japanese women operating in remote areas. The intelligence rumors that had circulated in the immediate post-war period gradually ceased, Whether this silence represented successful concealment of continuing operations or the final resolution of the conditioning program remained unclear. The classified nature of relevant investigations prevented public acknowledgement of either possibility. Facility Echo 7 was demolished in 1948, 3 years after the war's end. Official records listed the reason as structural deterioration due to tropical climate conditions. However, intelligence files suggest the destruction was ordered to eliminate any remaining evidence of the conditioning incident. The site reverted to jungle growth within a decade. Local Philippine authorities showed no interest in preserving what they considered a minor wartime installation. No historical markers commemorate the facility or acknowledge the events that transpired there. Sergeant Olivia Carter's post-war career included extensive work with psychological operations research. Her classified reports influenced development of counter-conditioning techniques used throughout the Cold War period. However, her specific experiences at Facility Echo 7 were never publicly acknowledged. Dr. Margaret Walsh's medical research continued to reference her observations from the Pacific Theater, without identifying specific cases. Her contributions to understanding trauma-based conditioning informed treatment protocols for decades, though the foundational experiences remained classified. The broader implications of systematic conditioning among civilian populations influenced intelligence operations throughout the second half of the 20th century. However, the specific lessons learned from Facility Echo 7 remained restricted to specialized personnel within intelligence organizations. The fate of the 43 women became a classified symbol of unresolved challenges in psychological warfare. Their conditioning, brief rehabilitation, and ultimate disappearance represented the human cost of sophisticated manipulation techniques that extended far beyond conventional military operations. In the restricted archives of 3 nations, fragmentary records continue to document an incident that demonstrated both the reality of systematic psychological manipulation and the limitations of available countermeasures. The women who passed through Facility Echo 7 remain representative of unknown numbers of individuals whose minds became battlefields in a war that extended far beyond conventional weapons. Until today, intelligence agencies maintain classified protocols for identifying and managing individuals who may have been subjected to systematic conditioning during military conflicts. The techniques developed in response to incidents like Facility Echo 7 continue to influence operations in contemporary psychological warfare environments. The rice paper message, preserved in classified archives, stands as the final testimony of women who discovered the artificial nature of their own psychological conditioning. Their warning about reactivation triggers and substitute dependencies continues to inform security protocols for personnel who may have experienced systematic manipulation. The empty site where Facility Echo 7 once operated remains unmarked jungle in the hills southeast of Manila. The compound, where 43 women experienced both systematic conditioning and brief liberation, has returned to nature, leaving no visible trace of the psychological warfare experiments that once took place there. The documents remain sealed, the women remain missing, and the questions raised by their case continue to influence classified research into the vulnerabilities of human consciousness in military environments, where the mind itself has become the ultimate battleground.